Hello everyone, welcome to this video about platform engineering. Today we're going to be discussing the build and deploy role. I'm Neil, your DevOps expert and IT contractor. Let's get into it. The tasks of a build and deploy engineer are wide and varied, but they all focus on one of four areas: building artifacts, storing those artifacts, testing the code that's built, and deploying it to the infrastructure that generally gets looked after by the infrastructure role. See my previous video if you've not watched that one already. Design and implementation. The build and deploy engineer handles a similar role to the infrastructure engineer in that there's usually a separate section that contains the build environment. This is all the things needed to build the artifacts and store the artifacts, as well as testing. Design decisions need to be made on what CI/CD or build server software to use. The most popular is Jenkins, without a doubt. There are lots of others, and of course there's also software as a service for building pipelines and software, stuff like Git Actions and AWS Code Build. Part of the design and implementation is understanding how best to work with the developers on the platform so they can self-serve wherever possible. We want them to be able to define their own jobs, and we want to make that easy. In my current role, we make that easy by providing libraries and frameworks for common actions that they will do within their design jobs. So when a developer comes along and says, I want to build my thing, they quite literally create a new job that says, build thing. And behind that, there's a library that then sets up all the other bits and bobs that need to happen in order to do that, so they haven't got to do it from scratch. It's largely boilerplate anyway, so it makes it easier. Decisions about storing the artifacts after they've been built can also be made. JFrog do Artifactory. This is a very big product, comes with a price tag. They also do a software as a service version of it, but it understands lots of different repositories and things. Not only can you store the artifacts after they've been built in there, you can also cache artifacts from various bits. So if you're using Python code, it can act as a cache for PyPy, storing those pips. If you're using Java, it can store various other artifacts of libraries that you might want to include in your Java programs. Other types of artifacts that you might want to store within this step are Docker images. If you've built your artifact into a Docker image, you need to store that in a Docker registry. Or sometimes, just some file storage space will work. Maybe you've got an FTP server, or if you're on Amazon, you could use an S3 bucket. Whichever artifact storage you use, it's important that it can do two things really well. Store the artifact to keep it safe, and make it available for retrieving when you want to deploy it. Automation. Automate repetitive tasks to reduce human error and make things easy. I've already mentioned self-service when defining jobs. Part of the CI/CD's job is to then automate the running of those jobs. In order for them to be automated, they need to be triggered. Fortunately, we can use something like Git flow, where any commits to a Git repository are picked up automatically by the build infrastructure and builds and sets off that pipeline in motion in order to build and test your thing. The automation piece can be expanded to also provide other self-service portals. We want to provide the best service to the developers we can, so we keep out of their way and enable them to do the best job they can. Monitoring and maintenance. Because the build infrastructure is there as a separate infrastructure, that also needs to be monitored and maintained, and where possible have alerts to track down things where we know about stuff breaking before the end customers do. We do this by having logs and metrics on the build infrastructure that can then be analysed, and if any of those detect something of an anomaly, we can then alert on that, tell the engineers that something needs to be fixed and done about it, and on we go. It almost goes without saying that we also need maintenance, keep those software bits up to date, patched and secure. Documentation. As a build engineer, we want to provide the best service we can, and this is self-service. In order for our customers to be able to use that self-service, we need good quality documentation. You might want to work with a technical documenter for this, as they've got more practice in writing document stuff technical and turn it into like English or something resembling what other people speak. rather than techie speak. This makes the services more accessible, and hopefully the documentation is understandable and more enjoyable for the customer to use. In conclusion then, the build and deploy role is wide and varied, like many of the other roles. However, in this, it's focused very much on the build, test, and deploy. We want to make sure that we can use automation to provide a self-service portal, and that means we need to understand infrastructure. We need to know how to build servers. We also need to understand automation and trigger points and API integrations and how that can all fit together, as well as programming skills in order for the automation piece to work properly. Because of this mix of skills, this is the second step that I would recommend anyone to go on. Start with infrastructure, understand how to build servers, followed by build and deploy, where you can understand how that value is then realized, as well as being able to get your teeth into all of the automation pieces. Of course, we're in IT, stuff always changes, so please ensure that you stay up to date with things, and I'll see you in the next video.